The consolidation of the Venetian Party in England and later in Britain was above all a question of culture. Francesco Giorgi, the Kabbalist, Rosicrucian sex advisor we've heard of, came to London to deliver his opinion in 1529, and he remained at the court for the rest of his life, building up an important party of followers, the nucleus of the modern Venetian Party in England. Giorgi wrote books about Kabbalistic Sephiroth to expound a mystical, irrationalist outlook and to undercut the influence of Nicholas Cusanus. Another book assures the aspiring wizard or magician that Christian angels will guard him to make sure that he does not fall into the hands of demons. Francesco Giorgi was a great influence on certain Elizabethan poets. Sir Philip Sidney was a follower of Giorgi, as was the immensely popular Edmund Spenser, the author of the long narrative poem, The Faerie Queen. Spenser is a key source for the idea of English imperial destiny as God's chosen people, with broad early hints of British Israel. Marlowe and Shakespeare both attacked Giorgi's influence in plays like Dr. Faustus and Othello, but the Venetian school was carried on by the Rosicrucian Robert Flood and, of course, by Bacon and Hobbes. John Milton, the admirer of Paolo Sarpi, an apologist for usury, is an example of the pro-Venetian Puritan of the Cromwell Commonwealth period. Milton taught that the Son of God is inferior to the Father, a kind of afterthought, and in any case, not necessary. Milton was the contemporary of Sabbatai Zevi, the false messiah from Smyrna, Turkey, whose father was an agent for English Puritan merchants. Did Milton's Paradise Regained of 1671 reflect knowledge of Sabbatai Zevi's meteoric career, which burst on the world in 1665? The British East India Company was founded in 1600. By 1672, adventurers like Diamond Pitt were freebooting around India.
In December 1688, the armies of the Dutch Prince William of Orange invaded England, interrupting the Hobbesian nightmare the country had experienced under the deranged King Charles II and his brother James II. A worse nightmare was to follow when William seized the throne of James II, for he embodied a more highly distilled form of poison which Venice had perfected during its sway over the remains of the Dutch Republic. This outright usurpation is blithely referred to in British Venetian parlance as the Glorious Revolution, which should give you some idea of how little regard for truth prevails in these circles. The notion of English rights and liberties was quickly transformed from fiction to fraud under William's dictatorial regime. When King James II fled to France, the rightful successor to the English throne was his eldest daughter, Mary, who had married William of Orange, reluctantly. He was a notorious homosexual. William's demand to be declared king was never submitted to Parliament for a constitutional veneer. Instead, he summoned a special convention, which granted him full power rather than simply the rank of the Queen's consort. King William's Venetian baggage included the evil John Locke, who became the chief propagandist for foisting the Bank of England on that hapless country in 1694. This was not the sort of bank you turn to for financial assistance. It was a gargantuan Venetian swindle, which promptly created England's first national debt to finance ongoing wars of attrition in Europe, imposed a credit crunch by cutting the amount of circulating English coinage nearly in half, and loaded new taxes on an already collapsing economy. The bank's chief architect was Venetian Party leader Charles Montague, William's new Chancellor of the Exchequer, who later attained the loftier position of British ambassador to Venice. Montague appointed the pathetic Sir Isaac Newton to oversee the recoinage swindle, and Newton repaid that debt by prostituting his own niece to serve as Montague's mistress. The bank's promotional hireling, John Locke, is better known as the peddler of the obscene notion that the human mind is nothing more than a tabula rasa, a passive register of animal sensations. He clearly had a higher regard for the cash register and openly defended usury as a necessary service for those whose estates lie in money. Locke's theories of government approximate those of a casino operator who lays down rules rigged for the house, under which the bestialized players compete for sums of money, which then define their worth as individuals. This is Locke's liberty to pursue property. His notion of the social contract, which guarantees the players, club members, the right to enter the casino, was in fact advanced to justify William of Orange's usurping the throne. James II, in effect, was charged with having denied those rights to his more speculative subjects, thus breaking the contract. Locke argued that the Venetian mob was therefore entitled to move in under a new one. By 1697, the Venetian Party's coup inside England was nearly total, and its members filled William's ship of state from stem to stern. They looked forward to reducing a most troubling matter in the English colonies of America: the impulse toward building an independent nation, which had driven the Venetians berserk since the 1630s founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1701, John Locke, as a member of England's Board of Trade, advocated revoking all the independent charters of the American colonies, placing their economic activity under royal dictatorship, and banning their manufacture of any finished goods. Yet even as the Venetians were swaggering over their apparent triumph, a powerful Republican opposition was building around a higher conception of the nature and purpose of man, which both inspired and opened the way for the later founding of the United States. Its leader was the great German scientist and statesman Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, who led what might well be called a movement for the pursuit of happiness, the ultimate goal of the liberty America embraced in its Declaration of Independence. In the face of the new Venetian onslaught in England, Leibniz set forth his view of human happiness from the standpoint of man's creation in Imago Dei. Writing on the notions of right and justice in 1693, Leibniz defines charity as universal benevolence, which he calls the habit of loving, which is to regard another's happiness as one's own. That joy is first approximated, he says, in the contemplation of a beautiful painting by Raphael, for example, by one who understands it, even if it brings no riches, in such a way that it is kept before his eyes and regarded with delight as a symbol of love. When the object of delight is at the same time also capable of happiness, his affection passes over into true love, Leibniz says. But the divine love surpasses other loves because God can be loved with the greatest result, since nothing is at once happier than God, and nothing more beautiful and more worthy of happiness can be known than he. And as God possesses the ultimate wisdom, Leibniz says, the notions of men are best satisfied if we say that wisdom is nothing else than the very science of happiness. As the leading scientist and philosopher of his day, Leibniz was widely known throughout Europe and among such Republican leaders of New England as the Winthrops and the Mathers, later extending to include, most significantly, Benjamin Franklin. From the 1690s onward, Leibniz's leading ally within England, Scotland, and Ireland was the brilliant anti-Venetian polemicist Jonathan Swift, who directed a cultural onslaught against the bestial notions of Bacon, Hobbes, Descartes, Newton, and Locke for more than 40 years. From the standpoint of reason, the Aristotelian empiricism of the likes of Descartes and Locke reduces the notion of man to the level of a mere beast, which of course is the prerequisite for imposing an empire of the sort the Venetians sought then and now. When Jonathan Swift took up his cudgels on behalf of Leibniz's refutation of empiricism, he ridiculed their enemies' ideas for what they were: insane. Swift's A Digression on Madness, in his 1696 work, A Tale of a Tub, examines the great introducers of new schemes in philosophy, both ancient and modern. They were usually mistaken by all but their own followers, Swift says, to have been persons crazed or out of their wits, agreeing for the most part in their several models with their present undoubted successors in the Academy of Modern Bedlam. By 1701, the lunatics of the late model incarnation of the Venetian Party had typically inbred a set of oligarchical families, mixing and matching Spencers and Godolphins and Churchills, the last headed by John Churchill, soon to become Duke of Marlborough. Churchill had begun as a page boy to Charles II in 1665 behind the skirts of his sister Arabella, the mistress of the king's brother James. Then, for similar services rendered, Churchill received £10,000 from Charles II's favorite mistress. With things apparently moving so swimmingly, the Venetians set their course for the next major objective: the destruction of France, the most productive economic power in Europe. Under the ministry of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the patron of the Scientific Academy at Paris, where Leibniz himself was engaged in the early 1670s, France had led the way in infrastructural and industrial development. So, in 1701, England launched war on France. More than a decade of bloodshed and destruction followed for the populations of both countries and their European allies. It was yet another rigged game in which Venice expected to be the only winner. There are inevitably loose ends in any foul scheme. Queen Mary had died in 1694, leaving William without a direct heir. Her sister Anne was next in line to the throne, but the death of Anne's only surviving child in 1700 presented a new succession crisis. An act of settlement was imposed in 1701. James I's 71-year-old granddaughter, Sophia, the head of the German House of Hanover, was designated as Anne's successor. King William died in 1702, and Anne became Queen of England. As the Venetian party expected, she quickly bestowed preeminence at court upon the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough, who had spun their webs of influence over her for many years. The problem for the Venetians was that Sophia's chief advisor and privy councillor was Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz. With Leibniz virtually a step away from guiding policy in London, the final battle against Venetian party dictatorship within England broke out in earnest. It was a conflict between the pursuit of happiness and the lust for empire. The Marlboroughs resorted to deceit, terror, and treachery to cut off political relations or even ordinary civilities between Queen Anne and Sophie of Hanover. Swift maintained a fierce barrage, both publicly and privately, against Marlborough's Venetian gang, to the point that he broke their domination of Queen Anne's cabinet, extended his own influence to her innermost circle, and during 1710 and 1711 drove the Marlboroughs and all their cronies from office. London desperately hurled Isaac Newton, that's desperate, into the fray against Leibniz, puffing the old fraud up with the lie that differential calculus was his invention rather than Leibniz's. Leibniz and Swift conspired to bring the great composer George Friedrich Handel from Hanover to London in 1710, seeking to uplift English musical culture from decadent braying and outright snoring. And in the midst of all this, Swift managed to get two of his allies appointed to royal governorships in the American colonies. Robert Hunter in New York and Alexander Spotswood in Virginia launched a drive in 1710 which opened the door to our future continental republic. That same year in Massachusetts, Cotton Mather published his Republican Organizing Manual, an essay upon the good, which spread Leibniz's notion of the science of happiness throughout America for more than a century. Benjamin Franklin paid tribute to Mather's work as the single most important influence upon his life. Jonathan Swift said of this period that he doubted there was another in history more full of passages which the curious of another age would be glad to know the secret springs of. The Venetians would not like you to know that Leibniz and Swift constructed some of the secret passages which led to the founding of the American Republic. But within Britain, as it came to be known after the 1707 Union, which England forced upon Scotland, the battle against the Venetian Party was soon lost. Leibniz's patron, Sophie of Hanover, the designated successor to Queen Anne, died in May 1714 at the age of 84. Her son George was now the heir to the British throne. William of Orange had been George's idol, and Marlborough and the Venetian Party had bought him many times over. Barely 2 months after Sophie's death, Queen Anne's life was ended, probably by poison, at the age of 49. The Duke of Marlborough, who had plotted in exile for years for Anne's overthrow, landed in England the same day. And George of Hanover was proclaimed Great Britain's King George I. Jonathan Swift had been forced to flee to Ireland, and George soon dismissed Leibniz from the court of Hanover. How serious was the threat Leibniz and Swift posed to the Venetian Party's conspirators? Just consider their satanic rage against the dead Queen Anne, who for all her faults had learned to seek something better in life than they could ever know. There was no public mourning, nor royal funeral. Her corpse was left to rot for more than 3 weeks. Then a chosen few serving George I buried her secretly at night in Westminster Abbey beneath the tomb of her great-great-grandmother, Mary, Queen of Scots. To this day, no stone or tablet marks her grave. Leibniz himself died in 1716. Jonathan Swift fought on from Ireland, from the position Queen Anne had granted him as the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. He became the acknowledged political leader of all Ireland during the 1720s, building a mass-based movement on the principles of man's God-given right to liberty and the right to national sovereignty based on natural law. Swift thereby extended Leibniz's movement for the pursuit of happiness and immeasurably influenced the growth of republicanism in 18th century America. Britain, however, began a rapid descent into hell under the new regime of George I. Previously secret Satan-worshipping societies such as the Hellfire Club now surfaced, heralded by the publication of Bernard Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, or Private Vices, Public Benefits, in 1714. Very simply, Mandeville argued that the interests of the state were nothing more than the maximum fulfillment of its individuals' hedonistic pleasures. The more private vices, the more public benefits. Therefore, the state thrives most upon the corruption of its subjects. Inevitably, Britain was soon locked into a Venetian orgy of corruption and new heights of financial speculation, leading to the massive blowout of the South Sea bubble in 1720. Appropriately, the government which emerged in 1721 from this devastating collapse was headed by Prime Minister Robert Walpole, who held that post in the service of evil for the next 20 years. The Hellfire Clubs not only proliferated, they became the inner sanctum of Britain's degenerate elite. The most prominent one, founded in 1720 by Lord Wharton, included on its dining room menu Hellfire Punch, Holy Ghost Pie, Devil's Loins, and Breast of Venus, a piece of meat garnished with cherries for nipples. By the 1760s, when the American colonies began to openly break with Britain, most of the King's cabinet were members of the Hellfire Club. When Benjamin Franklin served as our colonial postmaster general, for example, his official superior, Sir Francis Dashwood, was the head of the Hellfire Club. The murderous toll of such a regime upon the British population is expressed very simply by the following statistics. From 1738 to 1758, there were only 297,000 births recorded against 486,000 deaths. Typifying the bestiality of the emerging British Empire was the phrase smugly coined by Robert Walpole, "Every man has his price." We must not pay it.
British empiricism started from Bacon's inductive method based on sense certainty, taken from the Venetians. Then came Locke. Locke was followed by the solipsist Berkeley, who denied any basis in reality for our sense impressions. They're a kind of videotape played in each one of our heads by some unknown supernatural agency. Perception was the only existence there was. Then came the Scots lawyer and diplomat David Hume. For Hume also, there is really no human self, but only a bundle of changing perceptions. In his early works, Hume attacked the idea of cause and effect. For Hume, there is no necessary connection between a cause and an effect that the human mind can know with certainty. We only have some vague association or habit of thought that, as far as we know, one phenomenon has usually been followed by another. But in these same earlier works, Hume had at least accepted the importance of filling the tabula rasa of each new human mind with a stock of received ideas, of conduct, which can be lumped under the heading of custom. During Hume's later years, the power of the Shelburne faction became dominant in Britain. British liberal empiricism tends to be several degrees more rotten than its continental European counterparts.
In October of 1776, a 28-year-old English barrister named Jeremy Bentham wrote contemptuously of the Declaration of Independence, which had been signed as an act of the Continental Congress on July 4th of that year. This, he spewed, they hold to be a truth self-evident. At the same time, to secure these rights, they are satisfied that government should be instituted. They see not that nothing that was ever called government ever was or ever could be exercised but at the expense of one or another of those rights, that some one or other of those pretended unalienable rights is alienated. In these tenets, they have outdone the extravagance of all former fanatics. Shortly after penning this venom, Bentham made his philosophical breach with the American Republicans all the more clear in a lengthy tract titled An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, published in 1780. That manuscript would not only prescribe the founding principles of British philosophical radicalism, it would propel Bentham into the very center of a then emerging new British Foreign Office and British Foreign Intelligence Service, consolidated under the guiding hand of William Petty, Lord Shelburne, a man who at the time was de facto, if not de jure, Doge of Britain. Bentham categorically rejected any distinction between man and the lower beasts, defining man instead as a creature driven purely by hedonistic impulse. To wit, he wrote, quote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. Every effort we make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. The principle of utility, the greatest happiness or greatest felicity principle, recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation. Systems which attempt to question it deal in caprice instead of reason, in darkness instead of light." So taken with Bentham was Lord Shelburne that he installed the writer, who fancied himself alternately as literally the reincarnation of Sir Francis Bacon and as the Sir Isaac Newton of the moral sciences, in an apartment at his Bowood estate. Shelburne assigned to Bentham an English and Swiss editor to ensure the widest dissemination of Bentham's works in both the English and French-speaking worlds. Later, Bentham's works would even be more widely circulated throughout Latin America during his years of intimate collaboration with the American traitor and assassin of Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, and with revolutionist General Francisco de Miranda, a Venezuelan by birth who played a leading role as a paid agent of the British East India Company in the Jacobin terror in France, and Simon Bolivar. Aaron Burr, fleeing the United States, took up residence at the home of Bentham in London, and the two men conspired on a number of occasions to establish an empire, first in Mexico and later in Venezuela. At the very moment of his taking up with Bentham, Lord Shelburne was in the process of launching his most daring political intrigues. In June of 1780, weary of the failed prosecution of the war in North America, and convinced that the ministry of Lord George North would bring eternal ruin to his dreams of permanent empire, Lord Shelburne, through the East India Company and its allied Baring Bank, bankrolled a Jacobin mob to descend on London, ostensibly in protest over the granting of Irish reforms. The so-called Irish reforms amounted to little more than the forced conscription of Irishmen to fight in the British Army in North America, a move that Shelburne hoped would also defeat the pro-American Republican movement inside Ireland that had nearly launched its own successful Republican revolt against Britain in 1779. Led by Lord George Gordon, the Protestant rabble stormed Westminster, sending parliamentarians and lords alike down flights of stairs, out windows, and to the hospitals. For 8 days, London was ransacked, culminating in the storming of the Newgate prison and the freeing of all of the prisoners who joined in the assault on the Parliament. Lord Shelburne, as head of the Interior Committee of the House of Lords, personally assured the maximum terror by delaying the reading of the Riot Act, which called out the Home Guard, until violence had spread to every corner of the city. When the flames died, the ministry of Lord North was in ashes as well. North resigned as prime minister, and within months, Shelburne was himself in the new Rockingham cabinet as foreign secretary for the Northern District, subsuming the North American colonies. From that post, he would be the principal negotiator, directing the British team in Paris, sitting across the table from Benjamin Franklin. By this time also, King George III had declared himself wholly subservient to the Shelburne-led East India Company faction, the Venetian Party. As the result of these events, the shadow government formally took charge of the official state apparatus. The intelligence operations formerly housed at the East India Company were henceforth run out of the Foreign Ministry and the British Secret Intelligence Services. A postscript on Lord Gordon, Shelburne's agent provocateur. After a brief stay in the Tower of London, foreshortened by Shelburne's personal intervention with the Crown, Lord Gordon made off to friendlier grounds in the Netherlands, where, to the astonishment of his Scottish Presbyterian cronies, he became a convert to Jewish Kabbalism, taking the name Israel Bar Abraham. Shortly thereafterwards, he surfaced in Paris as an occult advisor to Marie Antoinette, and from that position participated in Shelburne's intrigues against the French Bourbons. The Jacobin insurrection in Paris during 1791 to 1793 was a replay on grander scale of the earlier Shelburne-instigated Gordon riots, down to the storming of the Bastille prison and the unleashing of the criminals. Lord Shelburne, as foreign minister, took the position that the former colonies in North America must be once again brought under the British yoke, but not through the deployment of military might or through claims of property title. For Shelburne, the battle cry of the new Venice, new Rome was free trade. As early as 1763, in a famous carriage ride from Edinburgh to London, Shelburne had commissioned two works from one of his East India Company scribblers, a man named Adam Smith. First, he commissioned Smith to prepare the research outlines for the study that would be later completed by another India House propagandist, Edward Gibbon, on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, a study critical to Shelburne's commitment to establish a new Third Roman Empire headquartered in London. In addition, he ordered the preparation of an apologia for free trade, which Smith completed himself in 1776 under the title The Wealth of Nations. In 1787, Shelburne's leading intelligence agent, Jeremy Bentham, went one better than Smith by publishing a series of letters from Russia that were assembled in a pamphlet titled In Defense of Usury. The final letter, addressed to Smith himself, chastised the India House economist for not going far enough in his embrace of unbridled monetary dictatorship. Bentham demanded an end to all restrictions on usurious interest rates, employing the liberal argument that suppression of usury stifled invention. Smith immediately wrote of Bentham's In Defense of Usury, quote, "The work is one of a superior man." Shelburne's own most eloquent plea for unbridled free trade and usury came during his brief tenure as prime minister from 1782 to 1783. Although he had formerly preferred to steer British politics from behind the scenes in his capacity as the chairman of the three-man secret committee directing the East India Company, Shelburne felt compelled to briefly take the formal reins of government to ensure the launching of his new British Imperium. On January 27, 1783, Shelburne stood before the House of Lords to argue for ratification of the Treaty of Paris, formally bringing to an end the American Revolution and the conflict with France and Spain. Quote, "You have given America, with whom every call under the heaven urges you to stand on the footing of brethren, a share in a trade, the monopoly of which you sordidly preserve to yourselves. Monopolies, some way or other, are very justly punished. They forbid rivalry, and rivalry is of the very essence of well-being of trade. I avow that monopoly is always unwise, but if there is any nation under heaven which ought to be the first to reject monopoly, it is the English. Situated as we are between the old world and the new, and between southern and northern Europe, all we ought to covet on earth is free trade. With more industry, with more capital, with more enterprise than any trading nation on earth, it ought to be our constant cry, let every market be open." Shelburne's policy of unbridled free trade war between Britain against the United States nearly destroyed the American Republic at birth. Fortunately, some of America's founding fathers clearly and unambiguously understood the danger of Shelburne's free trade ruse. They launched a crucial debate over the need for a strong federal constitution. But for the Federalist debate and the resulting United States Constitution of 1789, Shelburne's scheme for the rapid bankrupting and reabsorbing of North America into the British Imperium would have likely succeeded. Alexander Hamilton was blunt in his Federalist paper number 11, published in November 1787. Quote, "The adventurous spirit of America has already excited uneasy sensations in several of the maritime powers of Europe. If we could unite and can continue united, we may counteract a policy so unfriendly to our prosperity in a variety of ways. Suppose, for instance, we had a government in America capable of excluding Great Britain from all of our ports. What would be the probable operation of this step upon her politics? Would it not enable us to negotiate with the fairest prospect of success for commercial privileges of the most valuable and extensive kind in the domain of that kingdom? Even with these pressing matters still unresolved in North America, Shelburne and Bentham turned their attention to another critical front directly across the English Channel in France. The 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763 had stripped France of its once formidable maritime capacity. Shelburne now sought to destroy France as an economic and military rival on the continent as well. From the outset, the Jacobin terror was a British East India Company, British Foreign Office orchestrated affair. The bloody massacre of France's scientific elite was systematically carried out, although by French hands manning French guillotines, by the guiding hand from London. Jacques Necker, a Geneva-born Protestant, slavishly pro-British banker, had been installed through the efforts of Shelburne's leading ally in France, Philippe the Duke of Orleans, as finance minister. Necker's daughter, the infamous Madame de Staël, would later run one of Shelburne's most important Parisian salons. Although Necker had failed in repeated efforts to block France from allying with the Americans during the American Revolution, he did succeed in presiding over the depletion of the French treasury and the collapse of the French credit system, greatly aided by the free trade agreements between England and France. Economic crisis across France was the precondition for political chaos and insurrection, and Shelburne readied the projected destabilization by creating what he himself called the radical writer's shop at his Beauwood estate, staffed by Jeremy Bentham, the Genevan Antion Dumont, and the Englishman Samuel Romilly. Speeches were prepared by Bentham, translated and transported by diplomatic pouch and other means to Paris, where leaders of the Jacobin terror, Marat, Danton, Robespierre, delivered the fiery oratories. Records of East India Company payments to these leading Jacobins are still on file to this day at the British Museum. So taken up with the events in France was Bentham that on the 25th of November, 1791, he wrote to National Assemblyman J.P. Garon, offering to move to Paris to take charge of the penal system. Enclosing a draft of his Panopticon proposal, Bentham wrote, quote, "Allow me to construct a prison on this model. I will be the gaoler. You will see by the memoir, this gaoler will have no salary, will cost nothing to the nation. The more I reflect, the more it appears to me that the execution of the project should be in the hands of the inventor." At the same time, he was proposing to assume the post of chief gaoler of the Jacobin terror, which sent many of France's greatest scientists and the majority of pro-American Republicans to the guillotines or the prisons. Bentham made no bones about his loyalties. In accepting the honorary title of Citizen of France, Bentham wrote to the Jacobin Interior Minister in October 1792, quote, "I should think myself a weak reasoner and a bad citizen, were I not, though a royalist in London, a Republican in Paris." Bentham's Panopticon scheme was literally a slave labor camp, first designed when he was visiting his brother, a Shelburne spy in Russia, in 1787. Asked by Prince Potemkin, the minister of Catherine the Great, to help procure a steam engine to build up Russian industry, Bentham argued that human labor, not steam power, ought to be sufficient. His design, complete with elaborate architectural drawings, called for criminals, the indigent, and the retarded, along with their children, to be placed in jail cells equipped with primitive machinery, run by a central power source, which in turn was fueled by swings, merry-go-rounds, and seesaws in the children's own cell block. The energy expended by the children playing on the toys would drive the factory. A central guard room affixed with two-way mirrors would permit one guard to oversee the slave labor of hundreds of inmates. Above the main door of the Panopticon was to be a sign reading, quote, "Had they been industrious when free, they need not have drudged here like slaves." During his tour of Russia and the Ottoman Empire, when he devised his Panopticon scheme and wrote In Defense of Usury, Bentham had also written in his personal diary, "It is an old maxim of mine that interest, as love, should be free." It is therefore of little shock that we find Bentham also writing in 1785 an essay on the subject of pederasty, arguing against any sanctions against homosexuality, lesbianism, masturbation, and bestiality. Bentham dismissed the harsh penalties then in force against pederasty as the result of irrational religious fears born of the Old Testament destruction of Sodom and perpetuated by society's, quote, "irrational antipathy to pleasure in general and sexual pleasure in particular." Christian morality, like every other expression of natural law, had no place in Bentham's world of pleasure and pain. In the wake of the initial success in bringing France to its knees via the brutal Jacobin terror, Bentham sponsored several generations of philosophical radicals, from his closest proteges, James Mill and Sir John Bowring, to James Mill's son, John Stuart Mill, Thomas Carlyle, and David Urquhart. Carlyle, under the watchful eye of John Stuart Mill, penned the official British history of the French Revolution, needless to say, burying the role of Shelburne, Bentham, and their entire cabal in that horrific event. Bowring, Bentham's long-suffering personal secretary, would supervise the publication of Bentham's collected works in an 11-volume series, would serve as Lord Palmerston's agent handler of the notorious Giuseppe Mazzini, and would instigate the Second Opium War against China from his post as emissary in Canton. Urquhart, one of the youngest of the Benthamites, would play the role of agent handler for Karl Marx. Upon his death in 1832, Bentham's body was dissected and stuffed, his head cast in bronze and placed at his feet, with a mask affixed in its place. For years, the mummified Bentham, seated in his favorite chair inside a glass case, was an ever-present participant in all of the meetings of his radical circle. To this day, the mummy enjoys a place of prominence at London University.
Empire of Tsar Alexander II, with 2 Russian fleets being sent to American ports in 1863, with orders from the Tsar to join Lincoln in fighting against Britain and France should general war break out. Mazzini, Urquhart, and their assets will pull out all the stops to isolate Russia and blow up Eastern Europe. In the midst of these preparations, we have the emergence of young Israel, B'nai B'rith, as an ideal British weapon against both the United States and Russia, and also against other nations. Lord Palmerston's enthusiasm for Zionism was stimulated during the Middle East crisis of 1840, when France backed a rebellious satrap of the Ottoman Sultan. The British found that while the French were the official protectors of the Roman Catholics in the Turkish Empire, and the Russians were the patrons of the Orthodox, the British had no group of Anglicans or Puritans to sponsor. The British turned their attention to Armenians and Jews. Palmerston ordered British diplomats to take Jewish communities under their protection. Lord Palmerston discovered that Britain was the natural guardian of the Jews. This gave the British a foot in the door in the Middle East and also in Russia, including Russian Poland, where 1/2 of world Jewry then resided. At this time, Palmerston's son-in-law, the Earl of Shaftesbury, wrote, "It may be safely asserted that the Jews contemplate a restoration to the soil of Palestine." Shaftesbury was talking through his hat. He admitted in his own report that many Jews would actually prefer a seat in the House of Commons in England to a seat under the vines and fig trees of Palestine. But the British resolve to force Jews to settle in Palestine was clear. The founder of Zionism in its modern British-sponsored form is not Theodor Herzl, as some say, but a certain Moses Hess. Hess is the man who converted Friedrich Engels to communism. Hess wrote parts of Marx's German ideology. In 1861, Hess will write Rome and Jerusalem, which attacks the great Moses Mendelssohn for the idea that Judaism is a religion and a culture. For Hess, Judaism is a race, in the blood and soil sense of Mazzini. So now yet another of Palmerston's theme parks will open its doors.
In the B'nai B'rith official authorized history, it says, B'nai B'rith's relationship to the Civil War presents something of a mystery. They say that the arrest of the B'nai B'rith's leader in Washington as a Confederate spymaster was unfair. They say that no one can account for why the group was not pro-Union, when most Jews were pro-Union, and B'nai B'rith's lodges were almost all in the north. Indeed, Jewish soldiers in the Union Army were intensely proud, mostly German immigrant anti-slavery Republicans. To solve the mystery, we go back 20 years before the start of the American Civil War. British Foreign Minister Palmerston launched Zionism in 1840. He wrote that the Jews desired to return to Palestine. Abba Eban points out that the Jews knew nothing about this. And a month later, the British landed troops in Palestine for the first time. B'nai B'rith was started officially in 1843 by some obscure Freemasons in New York to be a secret society like Freemasonry for Jews. B'nai B'rith was to shape and lead a particular political faction with a particular agenda within the Jewish community. The agenda for this project came out in a famous speech given 2 years later at South Carolina College. The speaker was Edwin de Leon, from a Jewish family in South Carolina that was already notorious for its involvement in the slave trade and in Scottish Rite Freemasonry. De Leon was later a leader of the Confederate Secret Service. De Leon praised his teacher at the school, Thomas Cooper, an English atheist and Lord Shelburne's adventurer, who had first proposed that the South should secede from the Union. De Leon hailed Cooper as a tender-hearted religious heretic and an earnest disciple of the school of Bentham and Malthus. De Leon said, "There is a young Germany, a young France, and a young England, and why not a young America?" He told the students, "Any great civil convulsion comes from a source that is unexpected and obscure. In the French Revolution," he said, "the priests and nobles were only the flax with which the flame was kindled, but those who first applied the spark were the filthy, obscure savants of the Enlightenment." De Leon reminded the students that the actors in that drama were only its creatures, not its creators. He then proposed revolutionary military action as the idea for his Young America, to spread what he called freedom by force. The Young America idea first bore its bitter fruit when U.S. President James Polk ordered American troops to invade Mexico. Young Congressman Abraham Lincoln exposed the president as a fraud, and Lincoln denounced the Mexican War as a slave owners' conspiracy that would wreck our country. Lincoln was driven out of politics until 12 years later. This British project matured in the middle 1850s, and its active focus shifted to the West. There were two important partners out there, Isaac M. Wise, B'nai B'rith Midwest leader based in Cincinnati, and Killian H. Van Rensselaer, a British military operative and Scottish Rite Mason Northern leader, also based in Cincinnati. Between 1854 and 1860, they spread a pro-slavery secessionist terrorist group along this route, the Knights of the Golden Circle. Wise's B'nai B'rith organization spread southward along the identical route. Their plan was to spread slavery into Latin America and the U.S. West, and to break up the USA into several small countries. In Louisiana, United States Senator Judah Benjamin and Scottish Rite Southern Mason leader Albert Pike worked together on this terrorist secession project. There is a bust of Albert Pike in New Orleans, celebrating his work in that pre-war southern base for the Scottish Rite, the Knights, and the B'nai B'rith. Judah Benjamin's relative, his uncle's brother Manny, had earlier written the Masonic Order creating the Scottish Rite organization, in which the Scottish Rite Northern organization, in which Wise and Van Rensselaer were now leaders. This order was written by Judah Benjamin's uncle's brother Manny. To start the Civil War, this pre-organized anti-Union terrorist force would strike for secession in the South. Those who stayed in the North during the war would be known as Copperheads, with headquarters in Ohio. Before the war, Isaac Wise had two B'nai B'rith local leaders in Cleveland, Simon Wolfe and Benjamin F. Paik-Soto. Wolfe and Paik-Soto also worked as political agents for Democratic Party boss August Belmont, the United States representative of the Rothschild banks, chief moneybags to the British Crown and British puppets. Banker Belmont paid for the Knights of the Golden Circle and Young America projects, which he helped plan while he was U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands. Benjamin Paik-Soto was editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, a violently pro-Copperhead newspaper that furious citizens forced to shut down during the war. Wolfe and Paik-Soto ran a Hebrew amateur acting group, which included their non-Hebrew friend, John Wilkes Booth. The war started in 1861. Simon Wolfe went to Washington as the B'nai B'rith representative in the national capital. In Washington, Wolfe joined Albert Pike's Southern Scottish Rite and Judah Benjamin's Confederate Secret Service operations. Wolfe was almost immediately arrested by U.S. Army Counterintelligence Director Lafayette Baker, who worked directly for President Abraham Lincoln and for Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton. The B'nai B'rith was understood to be a Confederate intelligence front. Their official history says the cruel and ruthless Colonel Baker had Simon Wolfe arrested, quote, solely because he was a member of B'nai B'rith, unquote. At the time, they say, Wolfe was defending several Southern Jews arrested in Washington and charged with being Confederate spies. Meanwhile, in Cincinnati, Isaac Wise's cohort, Julius Ox, got in trouble when his wife Bertha was arrested for smuggling drugs to the Confederate Army in her son's baby carriage. Later, Julius and Bertha Ox's son, the white supremacist Adolf Ox, you can see on the right, married Isaac Wise's daughter, to his right, and then bought the New York Times. Their daughter is here seen marrying Arthur Sulzberger. The U.S. Navy won an 1862 Mississippi River battle, and the U.S. Army took Memphis, Tennessee. Isaac Wise's Memphis B'nai B'rith agent, the British-born Abraham E. Frankland, was arrested and admitted being a Confederate spymaster. Julius Ox sent him supplies in jail the same day, and Frankland was released on a $20,000 bond. We'll hear more of this degenerate Frankland shortly. The next year, B'nai B'rith leader Isaac Wise was nominated at an Ohio convention to run for state senator on the radical anti-union Copperhead election ticket. Wise's running mate for Ohio governor was Clement Vallandigham, then in exile in Canada, whom President Lincoln had banished from the country as America's leading traitor. The B'nai B'rith's leader's candidacy caused a crisis and a newspaper scandal. The Cincinnati Jewish community was overwhelmingly pro-union. His own synagogue issued a formal demand for him to withdraw that forced Wise off the ticket. At the close of the war, on April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot President Abraham Lincoln, while another man simultaneously attacked Secretary of State William Seward. Lincoln died the next day. Here are some basic facts of the murder. Some months before he shot Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth deposited funds in the Montreal Canada Bank regularly used by the operatives of Confederate Secret Service head Judah Benjamin. John Surratt, a regular Judah Benjamin agent, confessed to plotting with Booth to abduct Lincoln and admitted to using that Montreal bank for Benjamin's funds. In the museum that they keep at the assassination site at Ford's Theater, the National Park Service displays a coding sheet, a decoding sheet, found by police in John Wilkes Booth's trunk. They display alongside it a matching coding device which was found in the office of Judah Benjamin. At the time John Wilkes Booth shot President Lincoln, Booth's old acquaintance, Benjamin Paik-Soto, was international president of the B'nai B'rith. Only hours before going to Ford's Theater to shoot the president, Booth met with his old friend, B'nai B'rith Washington chief Simon Wolfe, for a confidential discussion over some drinks at the Willard Hotel. Simon Wolfe later claimed that at this meeting, Booth told him about a woman who had turned down Booth's marriage proposal. That evening, Booth murdered Abraham Lincoln, and Wolfe attributed the killing to Booth's anguish over his broken heart. So the lone assassin story of John Hinckley and Jodie Foster is an old story. Simon Wolfe was later a prime founder of the Anti-Defamation League. After the war, the Ku Klux Klan was started up in Tennessee to stop newly freed blacks from voting. With their occult satanic rituals and costumes, the KKK burned and tortured blacks and pro-USA whites. The Klan's national headquarters was Memphis, where KKK leaders Albert Pike and Nathan Bedford Forrest lived and attended lodge together. Memphis B'nai B'rith leader Abraham Frankland was an intimate friend of Albert Pike. Frankland had been in the Pike-Benjamin spy apparatus and wrote a blistering attack against the U.S. attempt to reconstruct the South under equal rights. Frankland now stayed on to aid Pike in his post-war satanic task. A notebook of Frankland's Kabbalistic researches, which is kept in the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, is a compendium of espionage ciphers, black magic symbols, Masonic ritual, and pagan religion. In his preface, Frankland acknowledges aid to his religious research by Albert Gallatin Mackey, Grand Secretary of the Scottish Rite, and the book Lohar on the Sephiroth, kindly loaned to me by General Albert Pike. KKK boss Pike was simultaneously working on his satanic masterpiece, Morals and Dogma, published in 1871. In his Kabbalistic researches, Frankland lists assorted gods passed down by tradition from ancient times, including 4 of the 13 great gods of Assyria: Assur, San, Bar, and Yav, plus the god Bel. Mackey writes that Frankland's god Bel is a form of Baal and was worshipped by the Babylonians as their chief deity. This is, of course, the false god which the Old Testament Jewish prophets warn the people against. Mackey says that since 1871, the Royal Arch Masonic system has combined Bel with Jah for Jehovah and On for the Egyptian sun god into Jah Bel On as an explanation for God. The Hebrew menorah, blasphemously used in the Royal Arch Masonic ritual, is displayed in the Alexandria, Virginia Masonic Temple. Other pages of Frankland's notebook contain cipher and private cipher, philosophical and hermetic alphabet, cipher of the Rose Cross, and 10 Kabbalistic spheres. In his Morals and Dogma, KKK boss Albert Pike celebrates the collaboration between these 2 Memphis Masonic chiefs, Pike and Frankland, at the height of the bloodiest assassination wave in U.S. history. Pike says, "One is filled with admiration on penetrating into the sanctuary of the Kabbalah, at seeing a doctrine so logical, so simple, and at the same time so absolute, a philosophy summed up by counting on one's fingers. 10 ciphers and 22 letters. A triangle, a square, and a circle. These are all the elements of the Kabbalah." So, as their Ku Klux Klan murdered its way to power, Albert Pike appointed Abraham Frankland the head of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry for the state of Tennessee, and an emeritus member of the Supreme Council. Simultaneously, Isaac Wise appointed Abraham Frankland the president of the B'nai B'rith district for Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas. At the beginning of this century, Isaac Wise's grandson, Adolph Ox, the owner of the New York Times, wrote a series of editorials attacking black voting rights in those southern states. This vicious editorial campaign helped swing the North behind the new anti-black Jim Crow laws which were then being written, which finally reversed rights gained by Union blood during the Civil War. The Ox-Sulzberger family, a great power in the B'nai B'rith, has remained in control of the New York Times ever since.